going to read the lesson, The Visit to the Mansion, an extract from Little Women, written by Louisa May Alcott. About the author. Louisa May Alcott was one of the most renowned American authors of her time. Little Women, her most famous novel, was based on her childhood with her three sisters. Alcott's family faced a lot of financial difficulties, so Alcott had to work from an early age to support her family. Writing became a way for her to express her emotions and her creativity. Alcott loosely based this novel on her experiences growing up with her three sisters. The Visit to the Mansion. Jo March sometimes stood before her old brown house and looked at the stately mansion of the Lawrences. She knew that only old Mr. Laurence and his grandson Laurie lived there. But to her, the mansion seemed to be an enchanted palace filled with delightful things. She longed to see them and befriend Laurie, who looked very lonely and shy. So she decided to visit the Laurence Mansion and tell Mr. Laurence to allow Laurie to leave the house and play. One snowy afternoon, Jo saw Mr. Laurence drive off. She set out towards the mansion and looked around. It was completely quiet. Suddenly, she spotted a curly head leaning against a desk at an upper window. There he is, thought Jo. Poor boy, I'll toss up a snowball and make him look out. Up went a ball of snow, and the head turned at once. Laurie peeped out, eyes bright with wonder. When he spotted Jo, he began to smile. Jo called out, "How do you do? Are you sick?" Laurie croaked hoarsely, "I have a bad cold, and it's very dull here. Will you come upstairs and talk to me, please? I'll ask Mother. Wait." Excited, Laurie flew about to get ready and tidy his room. A little later, there was a loud ring, followed by quick footsteps. Then there was a knock on his door, and Jo appeared. She was carrying a covered dish in one hand and three kittens in the other. "Here I am," she said briskly. Mother sent her love, Meg sent some of her delicious blancmange, and Beth thought her cats would be comforting. I knew you'd laugh at them, but I couldn't refuse. The kittens turned out to be just the thing, as Laurie started laughing over them and soon grew cheerful. "That looks too pretty to eat," he said, smiling as Jo showed him the blancmange. "It is soft and will slip down without hurting your sore throat," said Jo. "How kind you are," said Laurie. "Now please take the big chair and let me do something to entertain you." No, you should rest. Shall I read to you?" asked Jo, looking at some books nearby. "I've read all of them, and if you don't mind, I'd like to talk," answered Laurie. "Not a bit. Beth says I keep talking all day and never know when to stop." "Is Beth the rosy one who sometimes goes out with a little basket?" asked Laurie with interest. "Yes, that's Beth. The pretty one is Meg, and the curly-haired one is Amy, I believe." Laurie paused. He then added shyly, "I often hear you talking to each other. Sometimes when I see you all sitting around the table with your mother, it's like looking at a picture." Laurie poked the fire to hide the sudden trembling of his lips. Jo was touched. While he was unwell and lonely, She was happy at home with her mother and sisters. You could just come and visit us, she said gently. Mother would be glad to welcome you, and you'll have a jolly time with my sisters and me. Wouldn't your grandpa let you? I think he would if I asked. He is very kind, but he thinks I might disturb strangers, said Laurie. We are not strangers. We are your neighbors, and you won't disturb us. Then Joe and Laurie started talking about books. Joe was delighted to find that Laurie also loved books and had read more books than her. If you like them so much, come down to our library, Laurie offered. Grandpa isn't home. Don't be afraid. I'm not afraid of anything, Joe replied, tossing her head. Laurie laughed and led her through the rooms. He let her examine whatever struck her fancy. At last, they reached the library, where Joe clapped her hands and danced with delight. It was lined with books. And then there were pictures and statues, strange little tables and bronze pieces, and best of all, a great open fireplace with quaint tiles all round it. What richness, sighed Joe, sinking into a chair and gazing around her. Theodore Laurence, you should be the happiest boy in the world. No one can live on books, said Laurie, shaking his head as he perched on a table. Just then a bell rang, and Joe flew up, alarmed. It's your grandpa. What shall I do? Well, what if it is? You said you are not afraid of anything, remember? Said Laurie, laughing. But it was only the doctor who had come to check on Laurie. Would you mind if I left you for a minute? Laurie asked. Joe shook her head and went off to look at a portrait of old Mr. Laurence. She was still standing before the portrait when the door opened again. Joe did not turn as she said, I won't be afraid of your grandpa. He looks stern, but he has kind eyes, and I like him. Thank you, ma'am, said a gruff voice behind her. And there, to Joe's great dismay, stood old Mr. Laurence. Mr. Laurence is very amused and invites Joe to tea. There, as Joe and Laurie talk merrily, Mr. Laurence realizes how lonely Laurie has been and decides to send him to the March's house occasionally. Do a character sketch of Jo March. She was a daring child. She is caring, helpful, and friendly. She talked all day and didn't know when to stop. She loved to read books. Jo is curious by nature. The stately mansion in front of her house seemed like an enchanted palace filled with delightful things which she longed to see. Let's look at Laurie now. Laurie looked very lonely and shy. He lived alone with his grandfather. He is happy when Jo visits him and warmly welcomes her. He is polite, open, and friendly by nature. He has only watched the Marches family as an outsider, and though they are neighbors, they have never visited each other's houses. Why did Laurie hide the trembling of his lips when he talked about seeing her family together? Laurie did not want her to see that he was sad to be a lonely child. He watches the warmth of the March family as an outsider. He feels that his wealth, his kind grandfather are no match to the sense of belongingness that Jo gets from her parents and her siblings. Who are the characters that we see and hear about in this extract? Jo March, old Mr. Laurence, his grandson Laurie Theodore Laurence, Joe's mother Marmee, Joe's sister Meg, the pretty one, another sister Beth, the rosy one, Amy, the curly-haired one. What difference can you make out between the two families? The Marches family and the Lawrences family. March's house was old. Lawrences lived in a stately mansion, a large and impressive house. They were not wealthy. They were very wealthy. Joe lived with a caring family comprising of a mother and 3 sisters. Laurie lived alone with his grandfather. They were happy and content. Laurie was sad, lonely, and longed for company. Thank you.